Convicted of shooting and killing 18-year-old Chyna Forney in Albany 2 years ago, will serve 25 years to life in prison. Alvin Foy III sentenced yesterday in Albany County Court after a tense hearing. Foy was smiling and laughing while Forney's sister read a victim impact statement. The judge criticized Foy for his body language and sent him out of the courtroom after claiming he was wrongfully convicted.
There are stories that keep you up at night, not because they're scary, but because they're so heartbreakingly real. This is one of them. In May 2021, just weeks before high school graduation, 18-year-old Chyna Forny walked out into the streets of Albany, New York, and never made it back home. She wasn't in the wrong place. She wasn't living a dangerous life. She was just walking, a regular afternoon, and then shots rang out. One of them hit Chyna. It wasn't meant for her, but it didn't matter. What makes this case even harder to swallow is who pulled the trigger. Not a stranger, not a faceless name in the streets, but someone the family knew, someone who had eaten meals with them, cracked jokes with them, laughed at their table, and in court, when Chyna's loved ones poured their pain into victim impact statements, he laughed, smirking as if none of it mattered, as if a bright, talented young woman hadn't just been erased from the world because of him. So, if you care about stories that deserve to be told, not just retold, go ahead and subscribe, join our community, hit the bell so you never miss an update. Now, let's take a walk through the life of Chyna Forny. Let's understand who she was before a bullet cut her story short, because her name matters. Her story deserves more than silence. Before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the heartbreak that spread through an entire city, there was just Chyna, a teenager with big dreams and an even bigger smile. Chyna Unique Forny was born on a cold January morning in 2003, but she radiated warmth from day one. Raised in Albany, New York, a city with grit, history, and a heartbeat of its own, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that made her stand out. She wasn't the type to be overlooked, not in class, not on the track, not on the dance floor. Chyna moved through life with purpose, and she earned every ounce of the admiration people gave her. She wasn't trying to be popular. She was trying to be better, better for herself, better for her future. And people noticed. From a young age, Chyna gravitated toward activity, not just to stay busy, but to build. She ran track, she danced, she joined step teams, she threw herself into school, into her community, and into every opportunity that felt like it might push her closer to something greater. She was a captain on her school's step team, not just because she could move, but because she could lead. She had a presence, one of those rare personalities that lit up a room without demanding attention. People followed her because they trusted her. They felt safe around her. They saw something in her, and she didn't stop at school. While many teens were still figuring out who they were, Chyna was already working as a manager at McDonald's, saving money, setting goals, and making real plans for her future. She wanted to be a nurse. She talked about it all the time. Helping people wasn't just something she dreamed about, it was something that shaped who she was. At home, she was the heartbeat of her family, the jokester, the motivator, the one who would give you her last if it meant putting a smile on your face. She had that kind of spirit, the kind that made you believe in people again. And it's that same spirit that makes her loss so heavy, because Chyna wasn't out here chasing drama. She wasn't in the streets. She was focused, driven, ready to walk across that graduation stage and show the world what she was made of. And then, one day in May, all of that was stolen. So when we talk about this case, we're not just talking about another tragedy. We're talking about what could have been. A life that deserved to bloom, but was cut down before it ever got the chance. It was Monday, May 3rd, 2021. Spring had just begun to stretch its legs in Albany. The kind of afternoon where the sun hits the sidewalk just right and you think, yeah, summer's coming. For most people, it was just another weekday, But for Chyna Forny, it was one more step toward something she'd been dreaming about for years. Graduation. 3 weeks. That's all she had left. Just 21 days until she walked that stage, diploma in hand, ready to turn the page. Her cap and gown were already picked out. Plans were being made. Nursing school was the next chapter, and she was so close she could practically feel the stethoscope around her neck. That day, Chyna was doing something simple, something every day. She left school, just like she'd done 100 times before, and headed to a relative's house. No drama, no danger, just the kind of routine that should have ended with her arriving safely, maybe kicking off her shoes, maybe talking about her day, maybe laughing, but she never made it. As Chyna walked along Essex Street, chaos exploded out of nowhere. Gunshots, dozens of them, not one or two, not a warning shot, but a barrage. More than 30 rounds were sprayed across the neighborhood. Whoever was shooting wasn't aiming with precision. They weren't thinking about who might be nearby. And they definitely weren't thinking about the consequences. One of those bullets struck Chyna for no reason other than cruel, heartless chance. She wasn't the target, but that didn't matter, because when bullets fly, they don't check ID cards, they don't ask questions, they just hit. Neighbors ducked, children screamed, people ran for cover, and in the middle of it all, Chyna collapsed. By the time help arrived, it was already too late. They rushed her to the hospital, but the damage had been done. The girl who was supposed to walk across the graduation stage that month was instead taken to the morgue. Word spread fast. First a whisper, then a phone call, then a flood of disbelief. Wait, Chyna, number not Chyna. She was just at work. She was just talking about prom. She was just here. Her friends, her teachers, her coaches all said the same thing. It can't be her. She didn't live that kind of life. But violence doesn't always care about the kind of life you live. Sometimes it just finds you anyway. What followed was grief. Raw, heavy, suffocating grief. Albany had seen its share of pain before, but this hit was different. This wasn't gang on gang. This wasn't some late-night alleyway. This was a good kid in broad daylight, walking a familiar street. And the worst part? At first, no one knew who did it. The streets were quiet. People were scared. Some folks whispered names. Others stayed silent. Because in communities like this, fear isn't just a feeling. It's a way of survival. Still, there was one thing no one could ignore. Chyna's death had cracked something open. A church offered a reward. The community held vigils. People marched. People mourned. People begged for answers. A memorial started growing near the spot where she was shot. Flowers, balloons, handwritten letters from classmates who weren't ready to say goodbye. Her step team held a tribute. Her friends released balloons. Her school held moments of silence that stretched longer than words could say. And somewhere, out there in the city, the shooters thought they had gotten away with it. But the streets were watching. And so was justice. The thing about secrets is, they don't stay buried forever. Not when a whole city is grieving. Not when a mother wakes up every morning hoping it was all just a nightmare. Not when an 18-year-old girl with a heart full of plans gets taken down in broad daylight. The police knew this wasn't going to be easy. There were no witnesses lining up, no video footage screaming out a name, just shell casings on the pavement, and a community that was heartbroken and scared. In neighborhoods like this, silence isn't always guilt. Sometimes it's survival. People keep their heads down, not because they don't care, but because speaking out can come with a cost. Still, whispers started making their way through Albany. Not loud at first, just low murmurs, the kind that float between street corners and back porches. Names were being mentioned, and one of those names made people stop. Alvin Foy. Now, Alvin wasn't some faceless name in the city. He was someone folks knew. But what hit the hardest, what flipped stomachs and twisted hearts, was the fact that Chyna's family knew him too. This wasn't a random street shooter. This was someone who had broken bread at their table, someone who had sat beside China, laughed with her, smiled with the same face he would later show in court. He had been around the family like nothing was wrong and attending memorials, but underneath that calm surface, something darker was brewing. Then another name came up, Jamir Manning. Another young man with a presence in the neighborhood, another person with ties to the chaos that unfolded on Essex Street that day. Investigators started pulling together the pieces. They looked at text messages, phone pings, connections between both men, and slowly, the picture started to form. The gunshots that killed Chyna weren't random, after all. They were part of a street dispute, anger, ego, a need to prove something. And in the middle of that storm, an innocent girl got caught in the crossfire. More than 30 shots had been fired that afternoon. 30. In a residential neighborhood, in broad daylight. They weren't aiming at Chyna, but they weren't thinking about her either. And that's what makes it even worse. A few people in the community stepped forward. Quietly, they dropped tips, hinted at what they knew, and bit by bit the police gathered enough to move. First came the arrest of Jamir Manning. It was quiet, strategic, swift. Then, not long after, Alvin Foy was taken into custody, and just like that, the names that were once whispered became headlines. Faces flashed across the news, and the families on both sides of the tragedy were changed forever. Chyna's family finally had answers. But closure? That's something different, because knowing who pulled the trigger doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't bring back the graduation. It doesn't heal the quiet in her bedroom or the ache in her mother's voice. But it's something. And for grieving families, sometimes something is all you have to hold on to. The stage was now set for the courtroom, where the truth would be tested, emotions would boil over, and one of the accused would show the world just how little remorse he really had. One of the suspects, Jamir Manning, took a plea deal. He admitted to what happened, second-degree murder. He stood in front of the court and accepted his time, 20 years to life behind bars. No excuses, no theatrics. He took the sentence and sat down. But the other one, Alvin Foy III, he chose a different path. He wanted to fight it, took it to trial, claimed he was innocent, which of course he had the right to do. But what happened in that courtroom? That was something else. From the moment the trial began, Foy didn't act like someone mourning the loss of a girl he once knew. He didn't even act like someone scared of the years ahead. He acted like someone who just didn't care. He laughed. He smirked. He leaned back in his chair like he was at a comedy show instead of a murder trial. And when Chyna's sister got up to read her victim impact statement, heartbreaking words filled with grief and pain and memories, he laughed again, in open court, as her voice cracked, as her family tried to hold it together. He laughed. The judge had to stop everything. "Let the record show," he said. "The defendant is laughing during the victim's statement." Even the judge couldn't hold back his anger. He called out Foy for being disrespectful, told him if he couldn't act like a human being in court, he'd be removed from the room entirely. Foy didn't care. He threw out wild claims. He tried to say he wasn't there, that witnesses were lying, that he was being framed. But the jury? They weren't buying it. They'd seen the evidence. They'd heard the stories. They knew what happened that day on Essex Street. And after everything, after the trial, the tears, the silence, and the noise, they delivered their verdict. Guilty. Alvin Foy was found guilty of second-degree murder, attempted murder, and criminal possession of a weapon. And when it came time to sentence him, the courtroom felt like it finally exhaled. 25 years to life. The judge made it clear. "There's not a shred of human decency in you," he said. "You laughed while a grieving family poured their hearts out. You mocked the pain you caused. You showed the world exactly who you are. And then it was over." Just like that, the man who once shared meals with Chyna's family, The man who used to walk through their door like he belonged, he was now walking into a prison cell, possibly for the rest of his life. But even with that verdict, even with the sentence, something was still missing. Chyna. Chyna Forney never made it to graduation day. Her cap never left the hanger. Her name was never called across that stage. The applause she earned, it never got the chance to rise. But her story didn't end with a bullet. It didn't stop with a conviction, because something powerful happened after the cameras left, after the courtroom emptied, after the headlines faded. Her community, the same one that carried the weight of her loss, refused to let her name disappear. On Essex Street, where Chyna took her final steps, the city raised a new street sign, China Forny Way, not just a name on metal, a reminder, a promise that her life mattered, that this neighborhood will never forget the young woman who once walked those streets with hope in her heart and fire in her soul. And her school, they didn't just move on, they celebrated her. They remembered the girl who ran track with determination, who stepped with purpose, who dreamed of becoming a nurse. They held vigils, released balloons, told stories about her kindness, her strength, her laughter, the kind of laugh that lit up hallways and lifted spirits. Even in death, Chyna became a teacher, a symbol of how much we stand to lose when we don't speak up, a lesson in how violence doesn't just take lives, it takes futures, families, firsts. Her story touched people beyond Albany, people she'd never met, people like you, watching, listening, feeling the sting of a life lost too soon. And maybe that's the point. Maybe her legacy isn't just the street sign, or the step team, or the graduation that never came. Maybe it's what you do with this story. Maybe it's how we all carry it. Maybe it's in how we treat each other, how we speak out, how we remember the names that don't make national news, but should never be forgotten. At True Crime Journal, we tell stories that matter. If Chyna's story moved you, subscribe, because there are more names like hers and more stories that deserve to be told right.